Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator. We're going to be addressing the topic of the Elmina Castle and very briefly the situation with the young people dancing on top of the Elmina Castle. There has been quite a bit of uproar about this particular situation with a focus on denigrating individuals who are identified as quote unquote black women. There's even a hashtag black women that goes along with this interesting narrative. I want to start off by pointing out that the narratives about the Elmina Castle, the standard narratives, those narratives are lies. They are fictions. And if anyone takes any time to delve into the history of the Elmina Castle, the St. George Church, the police recruit training station, they'll have a better understanding of what Elmina is really about. If you've done any research into the Moriscos and the Moranos, you know a little bit more about what Elmina is all about and the Mina people. You'll have a better understanding of the European takeover of that coast and the Europeans being Negro Euros. And so it's very important before sort of, casting all of these criticisms related to what took place on the top of Elmina Castle. It's important to think about the total history and the true narrative about this particular castle. That castle is not what people think it is. They've uh, identified it as some sacred place, but it's not sacred in the way that many people think of it as being sacred. So we're just going to look at some dynamics here. But what we are talking about ultimately is the Hebrew slave trade. We are not specifically focusing on Hebrews as enslaved people, although according to this narrative, some of that was going on. But what really appears to be going on, and you can see this if you listen to some of the bragging from individuals who identify themselves as being descended from Abraham. What's really going on here is people with that bragging, they are laying claim to the identity of the slave traders. And so, whether individuals are identifying as those 10 northern tribes or they are identifying as the tribes on the west coast of Africa, that, what is it, Judah, Benjamin, Levi, um, regardless of who people are identifying as, they are identifying as the slave traders. So if they are identifying as coming out of Europe, they are identifying as being on the west coast of Africa. If they are identifying in these ways related to that time period, this major trade time period, this major removal time period, what they are doing in all of that bragging is letting you know it's a dog whistle for they are the descendants of the slave traders. Now, scripture comments on this dynamic of Abraham's children being major slave traders. This is what they do. This is what they got in trouble for many times. And so this isn't something new. But what you have is people bragging about it, but at the same time identifying themselves as victims of a situation that, according to their own narrative, their ancestors actually created. And what you've, of course, noted is that whatever there was over in Europe, they took it and then named some other place somewhere else around the world after it. And so you have that Elmina Castle or that St. George's Castle or St. George's Church. You have that dynamic in Portugal. And then you have the Same thing identified with this Elmina castle on the west coast of Africa. And so here you see this dynamic in Portugal. And then, of course, you see the Elmina castle that is on the west coast of Africa. It's important to keep in mind that these are not monuments that have been created by the indigenous people of that land space. This has been created by individuals who are coming out of Europe, coming out of Asia, landing on that west coast of Africa. And so there's no need to feel sorry for individuals who are laying claim to these um, identities, these colonizer identities, but that are presenting themselves as victims of the colonizers. And because of skin color, it has made things very, very complicated. And so people have narratives related to skin color associated with all of these dynamics, wherein they've identified the lighter individuals as the perpetrators and the darker individuals as the victims, when in fact, if you actually trace these individuals, you will find that they are out of the same families for the most part. Even in the United States, if you have some people who are biologically from a particular family, we'll say Roberts family or Robertson family, the white ones and the black ones are cousins. Okay. So that's what you have really going on here. But you have these different narratives that are being run based upon these phenotypes. Now, the Moriscos and the Moranos, they are decidedly descendants of Abraham, according to their own narratives, according to the identities that they have. And sometimes you see the Moriscos and the Moranos presented as light. Then sometimes you see the Moriscos and the Moranos presented as dark. When you hear that they ran into Africa and hid in Africa and, pretty much mingled with the people in Africa and looked like the people in Africa, you know that those are the same people. So the people mingling, these are all the same people. You have the same thing going on in the Americas. And so you had people mingling based upon these phenotypes. And that's what created and continues to create quite a bit of confusion. One thing that is noteworthy is that a pattern with the individuals who identify as Hebrew is that there is not only an identity appropriation going on wherever they were going, they were appropriating identities, but they were also superimposing their identities onto others. And so you see this with the dynamic of labeling the indigenous people of the Americas Gad. Okay, so this really takes away from dealing with the fact that the people who are identifying as Hebrew, 10 northern tribes or those two West African coast tribes, it takes away from the fact that they actually removed the indigenous people and they took on the identities of the indigenous people. And then here you have them giving the indigenous people their identities. This is a part of ethnic cleansing, but we are so used to identifying those who are identified as Hebrew, as Abraham's children, as victims, that we don't really look at what the biblical narrative is about their behaviors, about their patterns. We are not looking at that. And then we are not looking at the historical narrative that many of them are currently pushing right now. And it's not a good narrative. It's a pretty bad narrative when you look at it in totality. And if you look, you can see these cultural artifacts related to these Hebrew identities. And so that Elmina Castle, Elmina Church, St. George's Church, um, it is situated in a place, Abiram. It is situated in a place that has been named again after Abraham. You see these roots, and then this Beniyah for this body of water that is revered. This body of water, this Beniyah, Benjamin, this entity has been deified. And so you see the reverence for the name Abraham or Abram. And then you also simultaneously see this deifying of one of these descendant names for Jacob's children with Benjamin. And interestingly, you have individuals who identify in the Americas as being Benjamites and also identifying as coming from that part of the west coast of Africa. It's also important to keep in mind that Africa, as soon as you hear Africa, don't think about the continent of Africa, think about Scotland. So this again is a dog whistle for Scotland. This is a dog whistle for Morisco and Murano. This is a dog whistle for Spain and Portugal. And so keep that in mind when you hear that name Africa. Don't automatically assume that it's about what you think it's about related to this renaming of that continental space over there. And quickly here, we have a discussion about Elmina Castle, that it was the last place that thousands of African slaves would ever see when they were leaving their homeland. We don't really know the real narrative, again, about Elmina Castle. It was controlled by various European entities, and there are some things that suggest that there's been a not only whitewashing, but a doctoring of the narrative and the actual physical structure. And so some of that has been manipulated in order to go along with this narrative that has been created. That building has served as so many things. It's unbelievable, quite frankly. But at any rate, this medieval castle, which is a European castle, is sitting on the west coast of Africa. And you'll notice sometimes when you hear these narratives about what took place, the door of no return, there are a bunch of these doors of no return. You think there's one, and there are many. And so interestingly, all of these people were using English, um, identifying these doors of no return. And so some of the history, of course, has been erased, so we don't really, have a clear picture of the total history of this situation. But the fact that the Elmina Castle was also a church tells you something about what was really going on with this Elmina Castle. And here you see that between 1482 and 1486, they constructed this castle. The Portuguese, of course, it's always the Portuguese. These people are just all over the place, taking over things and taking things that don't belong to them. What's interesting is Portugal is such a small place. So there has to be something else going on with this name Portuguese. It has to mean something else other than what we've been told it means. It has to indicate a collective of people in addition to what we typically think of as Portuguese. And so something's going on there where Portuguese, for the most part, are taking the fall for whatever took place. It's almost like the Europeans, um, you know, took the responsibility for the slave trade narrative when the Europeans were everywhere. The Europeans were also not only Blanco, but Negro. And so there's quite a bit of that going on with this identity theft, identity appropriation, superimposition of identity to create all of this confusion. But the common denominator is Abraham, and Abraham's descendants are those who identify as being related to Abraham. Whether we are talking about Abraham's descendants, the two, or we are talking about Isaac's descendants, whether we are talking about Ishmael's descendants, it all comes back to Abraham. And it's really interesting when they talk about the history of this particular castle. It says, under the auspices of the Dutch West Indies Company, around 30,000 slaves a year passed through Elmina until 1814 when the Dutch slave trade was abolished. And so now you have the Dutch entering into the narrative. So again, all of these people are the same. And so just because you hear one country name or another country name doesn't mean that these people are not related. And so it says again, Elmina Castle was rarely in use until Ghana's independence from Britain in 1957. And so what's going on with Elmina Castle is, regardless of what the truth is that it's used as a tourist attraction. It's used as a moneymaker. This is not some sacred space that has been consecrated because good things have taken place there. It is a moneymaker. And so that might also account for why individuals in Ghana were not in uproar the way purported Americans were related to what took place in Elmina Castle. I say purported related to Americans because oftentimes, even today, you have individuals who are identifying as African American or Indigenous American when that is not their true identity. The individuals are indeed European, the individuals are indeed African, but for some strange reason, this taking on this American identity and then speaking for what they are calling American blacks. This takes place very frequently. And you see this recently when talking about the young people on top of Elmina Castle. There were two females in particular who created some content, and when you see the females, you see brown females, and so it seems as though the way they are talking that they are African American. However, the referring to supposed African American females as hyenas, and both of them doing this is very interesting. That is some social engineering stuff going on there, and it's very possible, very likely that these individuals have an allegiance to something other than black people or brown people in America. You see this same thing going on with brown males who are identifying themselves as African American males or black American males. Generally speaking, those individuals who really are that, they are not focused on hating brown women or hating indigenous American women. They are not focused on that. So if you think about if you are Indigenous American, you think about the males in your family. Do they sit around, watching videos or finding fault with every single brown female that they know? That's not the case. And so some of this stuff where there's this extreme focus on degeneracy related to quote unquote African Americans or Indigenous Americans, that's not coming from Indigenous Americans. That's coming from another space. And it's even possible that the individuals don't even know they are coming from another space. They may actually believe they are who they are saying they are. But basically, they are identifying as descendants of Abraham. So we're going to leave it at that. Um, and so right here, you see that this castle has served many purposes. And again, none of them really righteous purposes. And so, this place that served as a house of horrors of sorts, according to the narrative, this particular castle that the young people are dancing on top of. The commentary here says, despite its atrocities, the castle also once served as a missionary sanctuary and housed a church. What's noteworthy when you do research on Elmina is that you come up with all of these names associated with Elmina that are biblical. And of course, if you've got the Moriscos and the Moranos running the show, you're going to have all of these biblical Abrahamic narratives and names associated with these different places. And so Elmina is in a district that is essentially Abraham. And so you see Abiram, it has an E in it in Africa, but it's still the same thing. And in Hitchcock's Bible names dictionary, you see again this Abiram, just like Abraham, just like Abram. This is high father, also indicates here father of deceit. And we've gone over this before, Abraham, Abiram, Abram, that this is related to father of height, and this is associated with pride. You also hear this when you hear individuals identifying as descendants of Abraham, as Hebrews. There's all of this loftiness, there's all of this bragging, there's all of this identifying self as elect, always identifying oneself as elite. Elite and elect are synonymous, by the way. So when you hear people talk about the elite, you are hearing people talk about the elect. And so you are hearing this pridefulness, this arrogance, this loftiness. That's what you are hearing. And it can be over the top at times because it goes on and on and on. And you also hear these narratives about being upset, sour grapes, about not having more power, not being in charge, not being in control, whether it's in control of the environment or very often in control of women. And interestingly, the women um, over which control is sought are indigenous American women. These are not um, what you would call Hebrew women. These are indigenous American women. And for some strange reason, those who are identifying as descendants of Abraham have an inordinate need to be in control of these women that are descended from indigenous mothers somewhere along the line. And then you also have the body of water that is associated with Elmina having this name, essentially, Beniyah, which, according to this narrative, is also Hebrew. Of course, when you see that ah at the end of it, you know what's going on. And so, again, it's like saying Benijah or Beniyah. You might want to do a little bit more research so that you have a better understanding of that body of water and the festival that may be going on right now. As a matter of fact, the festival that is associated with that body of water and the deity that has this biblical sounding name that is associated with that particular body of water and with Elmina. Again, what you have is no matter what road you take, these roads are all leading to Abraham.